Good morning. Welcome to our second day of Democracy Days 2023. My name is Paul Rosler. I'm political science faculty here at St. Charles Community College. And I'm just here to kind of welcome everybody. I'm excited for today's presentations. We had a good lineup yesterday. Today we've got Professor Gabe Harper talking about abortion in Missouri. Then this afternoon, and then at 11:30, we've got a discussion about the Greenwood Cemetery, which is a historically black cemetery, and how that relates to the history of St. Louis. And then at 1 o'clock, I'm actually back again talking about the Trump indictments. And then, of course, we have a full schedule for Wednesday and Thursday. So thank you for being here, and thank you for Caitlin and for everybody else who is kind of helping make this show run. Also, there is a table in the back by the League of Women Voters, and they will, if you are not registered to vote, they will help you get registered to vote. And if they're not there, I didn't see them when I came in, but if they're not there, talk with me for a few minutes afterwards. And it's super easy to register to vote in Missouri. So please talk with me, and I can show you how to register to vote. It takes all of 3 minutes, and you can do it from your phone. So it's fantastic. So, so let's begin today. Today, Professor Harper is going to talk about abortion in Missouri, so I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. So yeah, today we're going to discuss abortion policy here in the state of Missouri, what the status of abortion has been in the past in this state, what it is right now, and some of the really interesting things that might happen next year that could really affect abortion policy and abortion access here in Missouri. And I wanted to start out by saying, in this talk, I'm going to stay away from the moral, ethical issues surrounding abortion. Those are obviously really complex and really interesting, but I'm a political scientist, so I don't really want to get pulled into the pro-life versus pro-choice argument. Instead, today, I just want to talk about, like I said, what's going on with the law, what is happening with government policy right now in Missouri, and I also want to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so if you all have any questions, we can discuss the things that I'm talking about here today. So let's talk about early abortion laws here in Missouri. So Missouri came into existence as a state in 1821. Before that, it was the Missouri Territory. And pretty early on, Missouri passed a law restricting abortion. This is notable for a couple of things. One, like I said, this is only 4 years after Missouri came into existence as a state, so pretty early on in state history. And back then, when this law was passed in 1825, most states did not have laws at that time specifically banning abortion or restricting it significantly. Missouri was only the second state to pass a law like this. Connecticut was the first one. You can see here the law at the time in 1825 said that every person who shall willfully and maliciously administer or cause to be administered any poison or other noxious, poisonous, or destructive substance or liquid to cause or procure the miscarriage of any woman then being with child shall be punished under the law. The way the law is worded is kind of interesting in that it specifically relates to poisons or toxins introduced into a person's body to facilitate an abortion. And at that time, the way this law was mostly enforced, they were enforcing it against doctors or midwives who were prescribing abortion-producing drugs in a way that was unsafe. So the idea originally was you had women dying sometimes in Missouri because they'd taken these concoctions made up, like I said, by a doctor or perhaps a midwife. And as a result of that abortion, she perhaps hemorrhaged to death. And this is the kind of situation where this law would be applied. From what I was able to read, in early Missouri history, these laws were fairly rarely enforced. Another law was passed in 1835 that banned abortion entirely, not just specifically mentioning poisons or toxins that might be used to cause an abortion. But these laws, like I said, were rarely enforced unless someone died, right? The woman in question died, they would go after the people who had given her the drugs. If a person went to a doctor asking for help because they had had a very bad reaction to one of these drugs, or if an abortion was performed after what's called the quickening. And that's a term you don't hear used a lot now in the abortion debate here in the United States. The quickening refers to when the fetus begins to move within the womb. The mother can feel the fetus moving. That's usually in the 5th month of pregnancy. Truth is, back then, if abortions were done kind of quietly early in the pregnancy, these laws were rarely enforced. So let's jump forward quite a bit. So abortion's illegal in Missouri, and it has been since very early in the state's history, right? Now we get up to Roe versus Wade. This is in 1973. This was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court. A lot of you have probably heard of this decision before. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court said that Americans, well, they'd already established in a previous case that Americans have a right to privacy. Americans have a right to a private life that government has no right to regulate. And in the past, this right to privacy had been cited by the Supreme Court in saying that states could not restrict adults' access to birth control. So that had already been established. In 1973, this Roe versus Wade case built on those earlier decisions about birth control. And the Supreme Court ruled here, and I'm going to kind of simplify their legal arguments, but they essentially ruled that under the right to privacy, which already included the right to use birth control, women in the United States also had a right to terminate their pregnancies at least in the first 6 months of their pregnancies. And the way they worded this decision, Roe versus Wade, it was pretty strong. States could do very little to restrict abortion under this Roe versus Wade decision. For instance, in most states, young women under the age of 18 didn't have to seek their parents' permission or even let them know if they had obtained an abortion. Abortions were very easily available after this law passed. When you get to the early 1990s, at that point there were 28 abortion clinics operating in the state of Missouri, so there were quite a few throughout the state. So Missouri was compelled under this decision to allow access to abortion services. And I think it's worth noting that at the time, just about everybody in the Missouri government was pretty much opposed to this idea of liberalizing abortion policies. There was a member of the St. Louis County Council who was a Democrat who back then when this decision passed said, we are really disappointed with this. We don't want to liberalize abortion access in the state, but we're required to by the Supreme Court. So back in 1973, at least some Democrats were very opposed to this. The Republican Party, of course, was very opposed to it as well. Now, like I said, under Roe versus Wade, there were a few restrictions that states could put into place, but the state of Missouri did what they could. Everything they possibly could do under the law to try to make it more difficult for abortion clinics to operate in the state was done. And one example of this was something that was added to state law by the General Assembly. Our General Assembly is our state legislature here in Missouri, and their main job is to write and pass state laws. So they added something to our Missouri law here that says, well, the title of the law was Life Begins at Conception, Unborn Child Defined, Failure to Provide Parental Care, etc. And it says the General Assembly of the state finds that the life of each human being begins at conception. Unborn children have protectable interests in life, health, and well-being. And skipping down a little there to point 2, it says, effective on January 1st, 1988, the laws of the state shall be interpreted and construed to acknowledge on behalf of the unborn child at every stage of development all the rights, privileges, and immunities available to other persons, citizens, and residents of this state. So what this does is, according to Missouri state law, even back in 1988, from the very moment of conception, a fetus has full citizenship rights. Now, at the time, this was mostly symbolic, right? They could pass this law and say, hey, officially here in Missouri, we think that unborn children have all the rights of an adult, all the rights of a citizen from the moment of conception. But there really wasn't much they could do about this because of this Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court ruled the U.S. Constitution granted people right to abortion services. But it's certainly a strong symbolic statement. And later on, based on this article in our state laws, the state legislature enacted what was called a trigger law. A trigger law is set up so the way this one was written here in Missouri, it said that if the Supreme Court ever changes its mind about the legality of abortion, the constitutional status of abortion, if they ever allow the states to once again regulate abortion, like they did before Roe versus Wade, this law will immediately go into effect and it bans abortion throughout the state. So once again, you see this pattern here where the state of Missouri's government has a very strongly pro-life position, right? They did everything they could under the law at that time to try to restrict access. Now jump ahead once again to 20 years later in 1992. The Supreme Court issues a decision called Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Now in this ruling, it's called the Casey, described as the Casey decision. In the Casey decision, the Supreme Court made it clear we still uphold Roe versus Wade. Women in the United States have the right to obtain an abortion under their right to privacy under the U.S. Constitution. But what they did in this case was they gave states a lot more leeway to make like what they would call like reasonable safety regulations. As a result of this kind of loosening of the rules, from now on states, for instance, could also require that minors have to get parental consent before they obtain an abortion. Things like that were allowed under this Casey decision. And as a result of this, once again, you see the Missouri government doing everything it can to try to restrict abortion access in the state while still obeying this Supreme Court precedent. I put here, by 2022, there was only one abortion clinic operating in the state. The state of Missouri put rules into place saying if a doctor that abortions can only be performed in specific abortion clinics. They can no longer be performed in hospitals in the state of Missouri. But if you're a doctor performing abortions in the state, you have to have what are called admitting privileges at a hospital that's within 5 miles of your clinic in case there's a medical emergency. Now, this may sound reasonable at first, but from a pro-choice perspective, they saw it as another attempt to try to restrict abortion access. A lot of hospitals in Missouri will not give admitting privileges to doctors who perform abortions. So once again, it was another way to make it difficult for the clinics to operate. They would also have a lot of like really exacting inspections and things like that. And like I said, from the state of Missouri's government's perspective, this was all pretty effective. By 2022, there's only a single abortion clinic operating in the entire state. It was in St. Louis in the Central West End, near the St. Louis Basilica, if you know where that is. And you can also look at this chart on the right here that shows the total number of abortions performed in Missouri per year from 2005 through 2020. The blue line there is the one you probably want to pay the most attention to. That's the total number of abortions performed in the state. Now, in 2005, you can see there were almost 8,000 abortions performed that year in the state of Missouri, but it drops off pretty steadily. Now, some of this drop, you see, is due to other factors, not just the law. Abortion rates have dropped across the United States, even in states that have very liberal abortion laws that allow women to obtain abortions. You still see a drop in the number of overall abortions performed, and there's several reasons for that. At least sociologists who have studied this think there are several things going on here. Birth control is more easily available now. Younger people are less sexually active than they were back in like the 1970s and 1980s. That's another factor, right? So there's a lot of different reasons why the total number of abortions have dropped, in addition to, you know, some states are putting laws in place that just make it more difficult to obtain. So you see this drop here, but then you get to around 2015 and you see the numbers really start to drop. By the time you get to 2020, only 167 abortions were performed in the state of Missouri that year in total. Like I said, by that time, there was only one clinic operating in the Central West End of St. Louis. There were none in Springfield, none in Kansas City, none in Columbia, or any of the other large towns in Missouri. And even at that clinic, I'm acquainted with people who had done clinic defenses at that clinic before, and they told me that because the laws in Missouri had gotten so strict on abortion, whereas Illinois has very liberal abortion laws, it's a Democrat-dominated state, what they would usually recommend if a woman came to that clinic in St. Louis looking to obtain an abortion, they'd usually tell her, you should just go across the river to Granite City because Planned Parenthood has another clinic over there, and you get the idea it's just a lot less hassle. You should really just drive across the river. So by this point, you can see the state legislature had been pretty effective in really reducing the numbers of abortions performed in Missouri pretty extremely, from 8,000 or just under 8,000 in 2005 down to 167 in 2020. Now, once again, jump again another 30 years, we get to Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. Now, this is a very recent decision. This is just summer of last year, so I'm sure a lot of you remember this. It was, of course, in the news and was a big deal at the time. The Supreme Court had become a lot more conservative between 1973, then up to 1992, then here to 2022. In that space, you'd had a lot more conservative people named to the Supreme Court. Donald Trump, while he was president, named 3 people to the Supreme Court, all of whom were pro-life conservative justices. And a lot of people saw this coming. But in June of 2022, the Supreme Court released this decision in Dobbs versus Jackson. This decision overturned Roe versus Wade. It said, the decision said that case back in 1973 and even Casey in 1992, those decisions were just wrong. They said that the right to abortion is not included under a person's right to privacy. Clarence Thomas, who's probably the most conservative person on the Supreme Court right now, in his concurring opinion here, he argued that people don't really have a right to privacy under the U.S. Constitution. It's not really there, it's kind of inferred, and it doesn't really exist in the first place. At any rate, the majority of the Supreme Court voted to say that there is no right to privacy under the U.S. Constitution. Now, of course, this doesn't ban abortions throughout the United States, but what it does is it says if there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution protecting a woman's right to get an abortion and nothing in federal law, well, that means every state can restrict or protect abortion access as they see fit. And as a result of this, several liberal states like Illinois and California have actually written a right to abortion into their state constitutions. You get the idea? So in those states, like in their constitution, it guarantees a right to abortion. Remember that trigger law I mentioned earlier, though, that Missouri put into place years ago? As soon as the court issued this decision, the state of Missouri said, well, as of this moment, that trigger law is in effect. You can see several other states banned abortion pretty quickly afterwards. This is a chart that was made up in June of 2023. You can see the states colored red, including Missouri, have basically banned abortion completely. The states that are tinted light blue or yellow have put significant restrictions on the procedure, whereas the states that are dark blue, Illinois, a lot of the Northeast U.S., a lot of the West Coast, in those states, abortion is protected under state law and access is protected. Now, this stuff can change pretty quickly. Just since this was made up in June, a few of those states have changed. Florida and South Carolina passed further restrictions on abortion, limiting it to just the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, so very early on in the pregnancy. And you can see Wisconsin up there is colored red. Just this week, okay, what happened in Wisconsin was there was a law from 1842, similar to the ones I showed you from Missouri that were passed way back in the 1800s. There was some question about whether that law was still technically in effect. It banned abortion in the state. Recently, a state court judge in Wisconsin ruled that Roe versus Wade essentially invalidated that old law and no new law has been passed. So the way they saw it, the law is no longer in effect. So just this week, Planned Parenthood said they're going to start offering abortion services again at their clinics in Wisconsin. So that, you know, if you're looking at the map, even the state of Wisconsin should be changed to blue again because they're once again allowing abortion access there. So this was obviously a big deal. A lot of people had very strong opinions about this decision, very strongly supporting it or opposing it. Missouri's law, as I mentioned, is pretty strict, even by pro-life standards. There are no exceptions in the law for women who have been raped, for rape victims, to allow them to abort in that case. So under Missouri law right now, you can only perform abortions in case of a true medical emergency where the woman's life is in danger. That's the only exception. I read an article a couple of months ago that said in about the 1 year since this law went into effect in Missouri, they think only 6 abortions were performed in that year. You get the idea? And those were cases where there was like a medical emergency going on, and they had to perform an emergency abortion. Other than that, abortion is just effectively banned in this state, in the state of Missouri at this point. Now, given the strong pro-life attitude of the Missouri government, pro-choice groups feel that a voter initiative is the only realistic option for returning abortion services to this state. Let me stop for a moment and talk about the voter initiative process. About half of all states allow for this, including Missouri. When you do a voter initiative, what that means is the voters of the states can go out and collect signatures, right? And they can put a proposed constitutional amendment or a change to state law on the ballot and have the voters vote on it directly. In about the other half of states, like Illinois, for instance, doesn't allow for direct voter initiatives. In Illinois, if you want to change the state constitution, the state legislature has to write it up, vote to approve it. Then you ask the voters to ratify it, to vote to support it. In Missouri, it's interesting, and like I said, about half of states allow for this. You can go out and collect signatures, right? A citizens group or a special interest group, go out and collect signatures. You need about 170,000 right now in Missouri to do this. So you and your friends wouldn't be able to pull this off. You're going to need an organization, right, to do this. But if you get those 170-some thousand signatures, you can put a question on the ballot saying, we think the Missouri Constitution should be changed to do this, or state law should be changed to do this. if the voters by a simple majority vote to approve it, you've kind of done an in round around the state legislature, if you see what I mean. You've kind of cut them out of the process. You can see we've talked about here, and I think I've made a pretty strong argument, that from the beginning of this state, Missouri state government has always been strongly pro-life, like going way back, right? So pro-choice groups in Missouri probably realistically say the only way to bring back abortion access in this state is to do one of these voter initiatives. Right? And they also know that when these things have come up for a vote in other states, they've usually been supported by the voters. Just last year in Kansas, there was a thing on the ballot to change the way the Supreme Court of Kansas would issue decisions to try to get them to say they couldn't protect abortion rights, and the voters voted it down. In Vermont and California, now those are very liberal states, but voters voted to uphold abortion access. So right now, Planned Parenthood and several other groups in Missouri are starting to, they want to put, get a petition written up and start collecting signatures so they can put this on the ballot probably in November of 2024 to restore abortion access in the state. Now, several different initiatives are currently seeking approval. Some would broaden the law to allow abortions for rape victims. Others would establish a right to abortion along the lines of Roe versus Wade. One thing that's interesting about Missouri with these voter initiatives is anyone can propose one, like anyone. You all could go out and propose them if you wanted to. If you do that, the Missouri state government has to do an analysis. They have to find out how much it's going to cost, and then they have to write up a voter summary, like a summary that's going to appear on the petitions you're going to get signatures on, and that same summary of the law will appear on the ballot when you're getting ready to vote for it in November of next year. There's been some real debate about this. I'm going to tell you the Republican Party of Missouri is really worried about this. You know, they've looked at the vote outcomes in other states, and they realize there's a very good chance, you can't ever say 100%, but let's say there's a very good chance this thing's going to pass if it gets on the ballot. That would be the biggest defeat of the Republican Party in this state in at least 10 years since Claire McCaskill beat Todd Akin, right? And that was back in 2012, I believe. So this would be a major setback, a major defeat for the Republican Party in Missouri, and they're really concerned about this, right? So there's been some real disputes about this. Let me mention, there's the proposed initiative put up there by Planned Parenthood would basically write something into the Missouri Constitution that would be along the lines of Roe versus Wade, right? So the state really couldn't restrict abortions at all in the first 6 months of pregnancy, right? The way it's written, you could argue minors would not have to get parental consent or even let them know if they obtained an abortion. It would be really a very strongly pro-choice constitutional amendment. In response to that, some conservative groups in Missouri are trying to get signatures or something to put on the ballot that would just say that the Missouri Constitution is changed to allow abortion in rape cases, in cases involving rape victims, right? I think what they're thinking is maybe we could get more votes, we could get that on the ballot, and the voters would approve that rather than this big, expansive thing that really establishes abortion rights in general in the Missouri State Constitution. Now, disputes over the wording of the ballot summary and projected costs of the initiatives have resulted in legal action already. You can see the Republican Party of Missouri is basically doing everything they can to try to keep this off the ballot or make it look less appealing to voters. When you say you want to go out and start collecting signatures to put your thing on the ballot, right, to try to change our Missouri Constitution or state law, as I mentioned earlier, the state auditor of Missouri has to write up a summary. How much is this going to cost? Because that's valid, right? So when the Missouri state auditor, Republican by the way, looked at this, he said there will be no cost. Right? There's no cost to the taxpayers here. Now, when it gets to Jay Ashcroft's office, he's going to probably run for governor next year as a Republican. When he looked at it, he said, well, no, I think this is going to cost the taxpayers $45 billion over the next 50 years. And people are like, how do you figure that? And he said, well, if a bunch of people are aborted in Missouri, they're not born, they're not paying taxes. To get the idea, we're going to be out all this tax money. This is, you know, pretty iffy logic, but that was his argument. In the end, the Missouri Supreme Court had to get involved in this, and they said the way they read the state constitution, state auditor writes up the projected costs. The Secretary of State, that's Ashcroft right now, he doesn't get to change that number. That's what the Missouri Supreme Court, so they said, no, you're going to put on the ballot, this has no effect on like taxpayer revenue or anything like that. Now you've got another issue in that Ashcroft is in charge of writing up the summary that will appear, like I said, on the petitions you put out, and it would also appear on the ballot when you go to vote on it next year. And the one he wrote up was pretty negative. It said, if this passes, this is going to lead to unrestricted, unsafe abortions in the state of Missouri. Once again, Planned Parenthood is arguing that's biased language, right? He shouldn't be allowed to do that. Once again, it's going to the Missouri Supreme Court. I would bet you the Missouri Supreme Court says you've got to rewrite that ballot summary because this is too biased against the amendment. So there's already legal action with that. Now, like I said, I think a lot of Republicans are really worried about this in Missouri state government, and they think it's likely the thing's going to get on the ballot, and it's likely it's going to pass. So the Republican Party in the Missouri State Legislature, our General Assembly, last year argued for changing the ways that voter initiatives work here in the state of Missouri. There were a lot of proposals to raise the number of signatures you have to get from 170,000 up to maybe over 200,000, raise the number of signatures you have to obtain. And probably more significantly, these proposals would raise the level of the vote you'd have to get to change our state law or state constitution. So right now, if a simple majority of Missouri voters voted in favor of, like, say, a pro-choice amendment, it passes. Do you get the idea? It's now hardwired into the Missouri Constitution. So there was a proposal to change this to say, to approve any constitutional amendments here in Missouri that are through this voter initiative process, you have to get at least 60% of the voters to approve it. What they're hoping there is, even if a pro-choice amendment got, like, say, 57 or 58% of the vote in Missouri, it still wouldn't pass, right, because it didn't hit that 60% margin. Later, they kind of watered that down a little and said, okay, let's raise it to 57%. At least 57% of voters have to approve any changes to our state constitution through this method. But there are actually some powerful people in Jefferson City, powerful groups that don't want this to pass. The Missouri Chamber of Commerce, which represents business owners in this state, they made it clear they weren't crazy about this. The Missouri Board of Realtors, a group that represents real estate agents in our state here, they've made it clear they'll oppose this whatever it is. They'll run ads on TV against it because the Realtors Associations have used this in the past to pass things in Missouri like freezing property tax rates and things like that in some areas. So they don't want to lose this power to use this themselves. So last year, when this stuff came up, it failed in the state legislature. Expect them to probably resubmit these when the legislature goes back into session, which is early next year. What they'll probably try to do is put this on the ballot on August 30th, which is the date we have our primaries here in Missouri, get it approved, right, and then it's in effect in November. So even if you pass a pro-choice amendment with 58% of the vote, it doesn't pass now. You get the idea, because we raised the number to approve it to 60% of the voters. And one thing they've also noticed is, like I said, when you've looked at this in other states, voters have usually supported pro-choice amendments. In Ohio, just last month, they had a vote to try to raise the bar to pass constitutional amendments in Ohio, because once again, they're worried about a pro-choice amendment passing there. But that change to state law failed. The voters refused to change the law. In Missouri, at least last year, what they were talking about doing is, knowing that voters probably wouldn't approve some change in the law to reduce their own power, right, make it harder for voters to approve constitutional amendments, they were going to package it, and the law would do two things. It would raise the bar to pass constitutional amendments, and it would put in the Missouri Constitution that only U.S. citizens can vote in our elections. Okay, federal law and Missouri state law already say that. It would just put it into our Missouri state constitution. I think what they're hoping would happen there is some people would get confused and think, if I don't vote in favor of this thing, then that means illegal immigrants will be allowed to vote in Missouri. To get the idea? So they'll try to package it with that and try to convince voters that this is a thing to protect the integrity of the vote, not to, they would downplay the element about raising the number of votes you have to get to approve constitutional amendments. So that's where we are right now in Missouri. This could get real interesting next year. Also, I can tell you, some Republicans are worried that if a large number of young pro-choice liberal voters would show up to vote in favor of some abortion access thing here in Missouri. Now in Missouri, this state's very still likely to go Republican, to probably vote for the Republican nominee for president, whoever that might end up being. But in some states, right? More toss-up states like North Carolina or Wisconsin, states like that, they're really concerned about too, that all this attention to abortion might help the liberal candidates. Josh Hawley and Eric Schmidt, there are 2 U.S. senators right now from Missouri, they're both Republicans. They've both been kind of hedging their bets a little. Josh Hawley has made it clear, I'm very strongly pro-life, but I also think we need to respect the will of the voters. You get the idea? For that matter, Donald Trump said something similar a couple of days ago. You may have heard about this. He won't say exactly what abortion restrictions he supports, but he said that like not having exceptions for rape victims is a bad idea, right? And that it's unpopular. So that wraps up my talk here on kind of the current status of abortion law here in Missouri and talk about some things that may be happening in the future. So I wanted to leave plenty of time here to open it up for Q&A. Anybody have any questions about abortion access in Missouri, changes to our state law with the voter initiative process? We could talk about which is your favorite Star Wars movie if we run out of anything. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Is our St. Charles representative, is that Adam Schnelting?
I'm sorry, let me hear that one more time.
Who is our St. Charles representative?
For this area?
Is it Adam?
I'm sorry, just make sure I'm hearing right.
Who's our state rep?
State rep from this area?
Depends on where you live.
No, it was John Weeman, but he's a vice president now here at the college. It is Houseman is her name, and I'm just struggling with her first name right now, but it's Houseman, Representative Houseman, represents this district.
But it obviously it depends on where you live, because there's a lot of them in St. Charles, so it depends on what if you live here at this zip code right here, or
if you live right here by campus, it'd be Houseman. But like Paul said, the Missouri House of Representatives has 163 members, so there's a lot of like little districts all through Missouri. If you leave even like 5 miles away, you might be in someone else's district. Nice thing about that, you can go on the General Assembly's website and just type in your address and your zip code, and it'll say, this is your representative, this is your state senator. You get the idea, this is your person in the U.S. House of Representatives. So you can figure that out pretty easy, yeah.
See, to be fair, I have friends of mine that are pro-life Democrats.
Yeah.
And I have Republicans that are pro-choice.
Yeah.
So I think you don't want to say all Republicans are against abortion. I don't think that's a right characterization, because that, to me, polarizes us more. We already have polarization in our society. I don't like to keep...
Right.
We have to learn to get along with each other. We can disagree on this, but...
When I'm talking about Republicans opposing abortion, you're right, I should have made that more clear. I'm talking about people in the state legislature. And really, when you look at the Missouri state legislature, it's pretty pro-life among the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Right.
There
the
are
people.
pro-life
Yeah.
Democrats. They're Catholic that I know.
Absolutely. And what a lot of, I think, Republicans, once again, when I use that, I'm talking about the Missouri state legislature. What they're concerned with is, this is a majority Republican state, but it seems like you say, there's enough pro-choice Republicans out there that if the Democrats can kind of stay unified, they could probably pass one of these amendments. And that's what they're concerned with, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
People are free thinkers.
Yeah.
And anybody else? Raise your hand. No.
Stretching.
If you stretch, I might actually run over towards you, so be careful.
You've got a sort of expert up here. You want to ask any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make a comment. Is it possible, do you think, that with a new Supreme Court down the road, if a Democrat chooses more quote-unquote liberal justices, they could go back to Roe v. Wade? Do you think it could be reversed?
That's what's really interesting. Yeah, that could get really interesting. Let's say a Democrat wins in 2024 and a couple of people die or retire from the Supreme Court. You've got several more liberal. All they need to do is the liberals would need to pick up 2 more seats in the Supreme Court to have a liberal majority on the court. What do they do at that point? Do they go back and just say, nope, Roe versus Wade is back in place? In fact, even with more, maybe, like undo the Casey thing and go back to like the early 1970s and not allow states really any access? A lot of people have been saying for a long time now that we need to come to some kind of almost like national consensus. Maybe there should be a federal law that says, for instance, abortion is available in the first 15 weeks of a pregnancy, or even 12 weeks,
Other candidates
Yeah. That it's time for some kind of national consensus. But right now, the way Congress is set up,
What do you guys think? I want to hear from you guys. Come on.
We have another student here.
I just want to make sure that I heard this clear, that the politicians that are in place right now, they are worried that abortion rights will be more free with the younger generation beginning to vote?
Yeah, when you look at younger voters, younger voters tend to be more liberal. Not all, certainly. There's certainly young Republicans out there, but they tend to be more liberal, and particularly on the issue of abortion. You get the idea? Younger voters tend to be much more supportive of abortion access than older voters. Once again, exceptions, but that's the overall trends. And so, like I said, in some states, I think Republicans are afraid this abortion issue could draw more young people out to the polls, like maybe in Ohio or something like that. You're voting on an abortion amendment to the state constitution. That might really help Democrats in the state. Like I said, here in Missouri, I don't think it's likely the Republicans are going to lose control of state government anytime soon, but even if the Democrats pick up a few more states in the state legislature, they don't like that, right? Because more young people showed up to vote in that election. All right.
Okay, another comment over here.
Got one? All right.
Okay, so I'm wondering why it's like such a big like government issue. Like if you don't like abortion, then don't get abortions. And if you like abortion, I guess, then get an abortion.
Well, yeah, and then like I said, I was going to try to avoid a lot of the moral, ethical issues surrounding abortion. Not a philosopher, political scientist, right? And that all gets real complicated. I guess something I'll say about this, and this is a pretty controversial opinion in and of itself, I think there are valid arguments on both sides of the abortion issue. And that's why, like I said, we kind of have to figure out probably have to figure out some sort of compromise. I don't think either side's going to get completely what they want on this in the end.
I just find it interesting that like the party whose entire platform is like limited government intervention and like the right of self-determination can argue against like privacy as a constitutional right so easily. Like I feel like the fact that the Republican Party is so dead set in this abortion thing might decrease their legitimacy with like more, not just like fringe voters, but people that sway more libertarian and stuff. And I'm wondering if you think that this position is like sustainable long term, because right now like abortion is one of the pillars of Republican policy.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, the Republican Party traditionally was like, let's have smaller government, less government influence. That, to be honest, has been kind of falling away a little bit. When Donald Trump was president, Republicans controlled both houses of Congress for the first 2 years he was in. They didn't really make any real moves to really shrink the size of government. Now, Donald Trump has said if he gets elected again, he would try to do that. But I think there has been some reduction in that whole idea of we need to reduce the size of government. And a lot of, I'm not saying all, but some conservatives believe in some cases we should use the power of government to achieve greater moral objectives, which would get into the abortion thing. So, yeah, go ahead.
Have you noticed a trend when we're talking about like younger people like voting and stuff like that? Does it also like have to do with gender as well? Because I have noticed like more young like high school women and college women typically vote in favor of abortion versus men who are the same age, believe or vote once they reach the age against abortion. Like, can you speak to the statistics or the?
Yeah, I've looked at a few things there. Like I said, younger voters tend to be more supportive of abortion, older voters more pro-life, right? Republicans and Democrats, we talked about there's some exceptions, but you do see some overall trends going on there. With men and women, specifically what you were asking about, yeah, when I've looked at that, yeah, women tend to be not overwhelmingly, but noticeably more likely to be pro-choice. Men are more likely to be pro-life. You do notice that when you look at the overall, like when they poll people on abortion in the United States. So yeah, good thing to bring up. You see differences here. You see racial differences too. African American voters are more likely to support pro-choice policies compared to white voters. You know, there's a lot of different differences in the data there that are interesting to look at.
And just tagging on a little bit, there's what's called the gender gap, basically between the parties. Typically, women vote 55, 56% for Democrats, whereas men, 56% vote for Republicans. I think that's partly because of the abortion issue, but there are other issues too, but I think that's certainly an issue. Other questions?
Anything else while you got me here?
Comments? Comments. Comments are good.
Yeah, in the back there.
During all this abortion rights debate, I haven't heard much about IVF. What's going on with that in vitro fertilization? What is what is the policy now on fertilized eggs that are kept here in the state?
Because I'm trying to remember, what was it about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, there was a ballot initiative on that because the state of Missouri had restricted how you could do experimentation with fertilized eggs. And the voters approved a thing backed by the Democratic Party to allow doctors and medical associations in Missouri to use fertilized eggs in genetic research. But as far as the laws of fertilization, this gets to be a really interesting thing for pro-life persons. So if you believe life begins at conception, you have couples who have had eggs fertilized and put on cryogenic freeze to maybe use later. Maybe they have children, as many children as they want. Maybe they kind of give up on the idea. Whatever, you've got maybe 5 or 10 or 12 of these fertilized eggs left. If those are human beings, what do you do with them? Do you know what I mean? And this goes back to, like, I kind of get it now. When I was younger, I was trying to figure out, like, why the Catholic Church would have been opposed to in vitro fertilization. Like, why is this a problem? I kind of get their objection now. Do you get the idea? If you believe life begins at the moment of conception. There have actually been some cases where pro-life families have actually agreed to take some of these embryos, have them implanted, and bear the children. But that's been like a handful of people, and you've got thousands, tens of thousands of these fertilized eggs right now here in the U.S. Now, what do you do with them is a really valid question if you're a pro-life person. You know, it can be a complicated question. Do you keep them frozen just indefinitely? Do you try to find more volunteers and implant them? You know, what do you do with it? So, yeah, so because you're paying for cryogenic freeze every year. Yeah, I'm sure it is expensive, right?
Well, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a statement saying in the Missouri Constitution that those are citizens?
Yeah, they'd be citizens. So under Missouri law, yeah, that could get complicated. Yeah. Did you get something?
Okay. I work at a hospital in healthcare, and I have more of a question. I just remembered as you were doing the presentation. I was like, oh, right, I did have a question about that. But when it comes to healthcare policy with abortion, I just know of, like, I'm not going to reveal anything, but hospitals tend to have to turn people away even if there are medical exceptions, because they personally do not want to be liable and put into prison. So could you argue that because of this, you know, what's in the Constitution, it is actually hindering people from being able to do their duties and perform their jobs properly? And is there going to be possible exceptions for that on the ballot, or for either parties, or?
Yeah, and that's a good thing to bring up, is that under Missouri law right now, if a doctor performs an abortion, or really anybody performs an abortion, unless there's an actual, like, real emergency threat to the woman's life at that moment, then at that point, you're right, they're subject to jail time. And what people point out is, if you're a doctor, if it's kind of even a little bit, you know, you don't want to perform an abortion, because I'm looking at, what, 5 to 10 years or something if I perform an abortion, and later on they said there was no valid cause. Like I said, last year, from what I know, there's like 6 abortions performed, and I'm guessing those were true, like, unambiguous medical emergencies where the woman's life was in danger right then. But yeah, obviously, if Planned Parenthood's thing passed, it would restore kind of like a Roe versus Wade type situation, so you couldn't punish doctors for performing abortions, at least not in the first 6 months of the pregnancy. You know, full stop. Yeah, they can't be punished right now the way the law is written. Yeah.
But now,
yeah.
that was the issue in the Dobbs decision. That kind of surprised even me when I knew, there were 6 Republican judges. Clearly, I knew Roe v. Wade was going to go. But what surprised me was that there were no protections. So in the 3rd trimester in Roe v. Wade, it had said that states could ban abortions with exceptions for the life and health of the mother. So there was, what I was kind of expecting the Supreme Court to rule is kind of basically keep everything except for the life and health exception. But there's a lawsuit in Texas, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a bunch of women who nearly died in Texas because their doctor said they needed an abortion in late-term pregnancy because they were going to, and doctors said, no, you're not close enough to death yet to get an abortion, so you have to wait another few weeks, another few more days, and well, hopefully you'll catch it before you die. But just in case, just be close to the hospital in case you actually start dying. Your fever spikes above 103, stuff like that. So they had to go leave the hospital, and so they're now suing the state of Texas. For that reason.
And I understand why this isn't necessarily a good option for all people, but they're trying to take people out of state a lot of times, because if there's a real medical issue, you should go to a state like Illinois or California. Now, that's easier said than done and expensive for a lot of people, but yeah. Right.
And I feel like there's, adding on to what she said, there's like bigger repercussions with the restriction of things like abortion, also gender care in the state, because when we restrict this and we do not put protections for healthcare workers, we're going to create a flight of health professionals in the area. Like, you can't do your residency here anymore, right? Because you can't observe an abortion. My mom works at the Brown School, where they had like that huge thing with the gender health clinic, and a lot of medical practitioners are leaving the state because we don't have protections for healthcare professionals in cases like this, where there's like a lot of people don't feel that they can practice medicine safely because they can't give people access to this care.
And did I see that hand up back here someplace?
Yeah. This is actually like very serious what you were saying. There are healthcare professionals leaving the state. I knew someone who moved like 3 months back to a state that allowed like her to do her job. Like, she didn't even like perform them or anything, but she was like, I'm with children all the time, like pregnant people, like mothers, and a lot of people discussed it, and they were like, I don't know if I feel safe working here anymore. So people are leaving in droves, and this is affecting our state, and we are not doing too well in terms of healthcare. Like,
anybody else got anything? Back there in the back, Paul.
So I know that in the state of Missouri, the maternal mortality rate is one of the highest in the country. And as they were talking about how like healthcare professionals are fleeing the state to some degree, and also knowing that the Black maternal mortality rate is exceptionally high, do you see any sort of connection between those two besides healthcare workers that are leaving?
You know, I haven't done a lot of direct research on that, on how maternal mortality rates relate to abortion access. It's certainly a good hypothesis. That would be one I'd want to like look at more, and before I made a comment yes or no on it, but I think there very well could be a link between those two. Yeah.
As they were saying, there's a potential ballot initiative from the Planned Parenthood, you said?
Yeah, one of them, yeah.
Yeah, what's the time frame on that? Because you said they have to vote on it by August, is the hope?
Yeah, well,
So-
okay.
And you said that Ashcroft has
Yeah.
to okay it, right?
Yeah.
Ashcroft is
yeah.
the Secretary of State for Missouri,
Right.
if you don't know. He's in Jefferson City. Go on.
So the way that this works, at least at the beginning, is they have to get their signatures in by May, which is why Planned Parenthood would like to get this stuff done in court so they can go out and right now start collecting to get a head start on it, right? Yeah. Yeah, got to have the wording nailed down before you go out and start having people sign the petitions. So they're going to try to get that done as quickly as possible. They have to have their signatures in by May, right? Once it's been approved and the Secretary of State had said, yes, they got enough signatures, this will appear on the ballot, then it's up to the state legislature to decide, will it appear on the November ballot when we have our regular elections, or will it appear on the August ballot when we have our primary elections? Just as a side thing, I think that's ridiculous that the Missouri State Legislature can stick stuff on the primary ballots. They think a lot of times that means less people will show up and vote for the primary elections. They'll tend to be Republicans. I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure it's really going to help that much. But what they're probably going to try to do is get this thing passed, added to our state constitution, saying you have to get 60% of the vote from now on to approve constitutional amendments. Then in November, that's where you put the Planned Parenthood pro-choice amendment. You get the idea? Now that we've already raised the standard, does that make sense? That's probably what they're going to try to do. Although I will say, we were talking about differences among Republicans. There are at least some people in the Republican Party in the state legislature who are kind of iffy on this whole idea, don't think it's going to be popular, don't think it's likely to pass. Last year, they couldn't get anything. They couldn't get anything put on the ballot. So it's not guaranteed, but they're probably going to try that again this year, at least some people in the Republican Party in Jefferson City. Anything else?
We've still got time.
Yeah. Hey, well, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. And really good questions and comments here and everything. So thanks. Have a good rest of your day. Come back and see more Democracy Day stuff.
Thank you.
Bye.
So again, if you're not registered to vote, please, if there's no one outside for Legal Women Voters, which are you guys out there, then bug me for a few minutes and I'll show you how to do it. It's easy. It takes you less than 5 minutes to do it. So, and there's free Constitution books as well. There's all kinds of stuff right outside the door. Come back at 11:30 for a neat presentation on African American cemetery.